Welcome back to On Caring, the Project COVID-19 Coronavirus Updates. In the first 5 vodcasts that we did over the summer of 2020, we focused much of our attention on the politics of the coronavirus, the epidemiology of the virus, and healthcare inequalities. In this vodcast update, November 2020, we turn our attention to what we're calling the political economy of the novel coronavirus. Here, we'll consider how politics and economics intermingle and how it is virtually impossible to understand the novel coronavirus without looking into these deep connections between politics and economics. In this podcast, we look at 2 Kansas towns, Dodge City and Garden City, both in the southwestern part of the state and both home to 2 of the largest meatpacking facilities in the country, both employing significant numbers of immigrant and refugee laborers. And along with liberal Kansas, they form what is sometimes called the Golden Triangle, 3 of the largest meat processing facilities in the country. And these 3 counties, Finney, Ford, and Seward, were among the counties in Kansas most affected by the novel coronavirus. And the meat packers in those 3 counties, many among them immigrants and refugees, paid a high price to keep meat on our tables. Here you see a satellite view of the massive infrastructure and facility for processing beef in Dodge City, Kansas, the National Beef Company. And just a few minutes' drive from the National Beef Processing Facility is the Cargill facility, which you see here. And here you see a satellite view of the cattle being unloaded from trucks as they're prepared for slaughter. Here you see an aerial view of the massive facility in Garden City, Kansas, Tyson Meats. In this podcast, we'll be visiting with a special guest, Dr. Donald Stoll, Emeritus Professor from the University of Kansas, who has spent much of his career studying meat packers and meat processing, labor migration, immigrants and refugees, and more recently has turned his attention to the crisis of COVID-19 among these meat packers. There are 3 counties in Kansas, Ford, Seward, and Finney County, all home to very large meatpacking and processing facilities, some of the nation's largest. The United States is home to 95 million cattle, including more than 25 million that are fattened for slaughter each year at feedlots. Not only does Kansas have the 3rd largest number of cattle on ranches and feed yards at 6.35 million, that was as of January 2019. Kansas also has a significant footprint in the cattle processing sector. In 2017, Kansas produced nearly 5.6 billion pounds of red meat, or nearly 11% of the nation's total. Kansas is also home to immigrants and refugees working in the meatpacking industry. Before we talk about COVID-19, meatpacking, immigrants and refugees who work in the meatpacking industry in Kansas, we want to provide some historical background. Dodge City lies along the Santa Fe Trail, which runs from Missouri to Santa Fe, New Mexico. And beginning as early as 1821, the trail was used as a commercial route connecting Missouri and the city of Santa Fe. The route became a booming trade route as more and more traders used the trail to transport their goods. The trail continued to be used as a commercial highway until the Mexican-American War began in 1846. The Santa Fe Trail was followed by the Army of the West in order to invade New Mexico, and following the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war in 1848, this trail was used to connect the United States to its southwest territories. The trail eventually faded into history in 1880 when the railroad reached Santa Fe. And it continued to be used for many years as a channel into the cultures of both Spanish and Native Americans.
These ruts you see before you, where the land is sunk and bowed, are remnants of the pathway to Nuevo Mexico. Near 60 years, the wagon trains passed along this way as wealth and power moved along this trail to Santa Fe.
You're listening to the theme song to Gunsmoke, originally a popular radio show called Gun Law. Gunsmoke was one of the most popular TV westerns in television history. It ran over 20 seasons from 1955 to 1975. Millions of Americans tuned in each week to watch Marshal Matt Dillon defeat villains in the Wild West of Dodge City, Kansas. From shootouts to shenanigans at the Long Branch Saloon. And what started as a half-hour show eventually extended to an hour due to its popularity. It was also the second longest-running television series of all time, with 5 Emmys. That was Gunsmoke, that was Hollywood, that was 1955, 1975. That was the Santa Fe Trail, early 19th century to the end of the 19th century. Today there are new trails that lead from Africa to Kansas and from Mexico to Kansas, and in particular to southwest Kansas, to 3 counties in southwest Kansas. In Dodge City today, and in the meatpacking industry throughout southwest Kansas, you will find Somali refugees. Somalia was created in 1960 from a former British protectorate and an Italian colony. Somalia collapsed into anarchy following the overthrow of the military regime of President Siad Barre in 1991. Today, many of those refugees from Somalia are living and working in southwest Kansas in the meatpacking industry. And before Somali refugees arrived in Kansas, there were Vietnamese refugees, along with refugees today from Myanmar. Still others have come from Central America and from Mexico, seeking employment and opportunities. Many are now settled in southwestern Kansas, also working in the meatpacking industry. You will find on our website, oncaring.org, a link to interviews with workers in Dodge City, Kansas during this time of the COVID-19 crisis. We're fortunate to have on the phone with us today Donald Stahl, who is Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at the University of Kansas, where he taught from 1975 to 2015, and I had the great opportunity and pleasure to be one of his students. His research and writing focus on the meat and poultry industry in North America, rural industrialization, and rapid growth communities, industrial agriculture's impact on farmers, processing workers, and host communities. Don co-edited Any Way You Cut It, Meat Processing in Small Town America, and co-authored Slaughterhouse Blues, The Meat and Poultry Industry of North America. He serves on the boards of directors of the Socially Responsible Agricultural Project, a national organization that provides support for communities affected by concentrated animal feeding operations. And from 2011 to 2020, Don was on the board of directors of the Organization for Competitive Markets, a nonprofit research and advocacy organization working for open and competitive markets and fair trade in America's food and agricultural sectors. We're visiting with Emeritus Professor Donald Stahl from the University of Kansas, who spent much of his career studying meatpacking workers in the industry, Today we're talking to him about his recent work on COVID-19 among meat packers and workers in that industry. Don, thanks for spending a few minutes with us today as we begin to learn from you about the impact of COVID-19 on meat packers in this industry.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to visit with you.
I want to start with something that you've recently written. It's a rather long quote, but it strikes us as important. You write that work on the line is tedious, monotonous, and risky. It wears workers down, and sooner or later, most get fired, get hurt, or quit. Take Maricel, an immigrant who helped me map the killing floor of the plant where he worked. He gave his 2 weeks' notice and worked his last day at the plant 8 years and 1 day after he started. When he began working on the kill floor, he was number 500 on the seniority list. When he quit, he was number 75. The clerk who administered his exit interview asked why he was quitting. You quote the worker. The lines go too fast. The supervisors are too mean. They push their workers too hard, and I don't like anything about working there. That's the end of that quote. You continue, befuddled by his answer. She looked blankly at him as he laughed. She left the space on the form for why he quit empty. You started working in the meatpacking industry.
I started studying the industry in 1987.
How did you get started?
I directed a team of social scientists in a study of Garden City, Kansas, which was home to, at that time, the world's 2 beef packing plants, one of them the world's largest. It was a national study of immigration, what was called the New Immigration by the Ford Foundation.
Why was the Ford Foundation interested in Southwest Kansas?
They were getting ready for the 1990 census, which everyone knew would show a more ethnically and racially diverse population. And so there were a number of stories in the press at that time about conflict and hostility between new immigrants and established residents. And so the Ford Foundation commissioned a study of 6 cities across the country of the relationship between new immigrants and established residents. They were Chicago, Philadelphia, Miami, Houston, Monterey Park, California, and then Garden City, which was the only small town, the only Midwestern town in the study. And so I directed a team of researchers that spent 2 years living and in Garden City and studying it. What brought immigrants to Garden City was the meatpack. It grew from 1980 to 1985, it grew by 1/3. Most of those newcomers were either labor migrants from Mexico and other parts of Latin America and refugees from Southeast Asia, mainly Vietnam, but also Laos and Cambodia. And so what brought them to Garden City was work, and work in the packing plants.
The relationship between immigrants and residents. What did you learn about that conflict?
Well, we found that what sociologists call the context of reception greatly determined the relationships between established residents. In Garden City, the established residents were primarily Anglo-Americans and also Mexican-Americans who had come up in the early 20th century from Mexico fleeing the revolution and to work in the railroads. And what we found was that really in Garden City, the relationships were relatively good. New immigrants were not taking jobs away from established residents. If you want to work in a meatpacking plant, you can. There's certainly they'll take anybody that can pass drug test, what they call the PIS test, and anyone who can pass the test and then can stand on the line and pull their count. That's what packers refer to as keeping up with the line. You have to pull your count. You stand in a long line, a disassembly line that disassembles the animal, and you have a specific job that you do over and over thousands of times a day, and you have to be able to keep up with the guy in front of you or ahead or in the line before you and pass your product on to the person down line from you. So we found that really there was the relations were on the whole good, that the community chose to see diversity and increasing ethnic and religious diversity as a positive thing. They were especially, when Vietnamese refugees came, the community really welcomed them And that was the result of, I think, some really progressive thinking clergy. The clergy and the newspaper was quite progressive, the school system, law enforcement, and they saw that as a positive and have continued to see it that way.
That was 30 years ago. What is it like now?
I think that it depends on where you are. The communities that we've studied have reacted differently to the impacts on the communities are always the same. It's rapid growth, increasing ethnic diversity, linguistic and religious diversity. And the other thing that you see in those communities is continuous turnover, because the packing plants have high turnover, and therefore it's kind of these communities are sort of a revolving door. People come and go. So the communities never really settle down. There's no doubt that after September 11th, attitudes toward immigrants changed in the country by and large. I mean, when I started the study in 1987, that was the same year that the Immigration Control and Reform Act, IRCA, was passed, and that was the previous era, during the Reagan era, when Americans were concerned about losing control of our borders and being invaded by immigrants. And that was a time when there was a lot of fear about immigration, but nothing like it has been in recent years. But in Garden City, that was, they saw immigrants as hardworking. They saw them as people who had sacrificed a great deal to come to Garden City. They weren't taking jobs from anybody. The town it's not a company town, but it's an industry town. It's heavily dependent upon meatpack. And so they were seen as making a positive contribution to Garden City. Several years ago, changed its logo and to a yucca plant. And the leaves are different colors. And the logo says, "The world grows here." And so it's a recognition that of the ethnic diversity, the importance of immigrants and refugees in the life of Garden City. That certainly wouldn't happen in Dodge City or Liberal.
You've had the opportunity to see waves of immigrants from Latinx to Vietnam, from Vietnam to Somalia. Could you tell us a bit about how immigration workforce has changed over the course of your study?
Yeah, when I started in studying there in 1987, what attracted me, I read a newspaper article about Vietnamese coming to southwest Kansas, and I went out there to check it out, and that's what got me interested to begin with. I mean, who would have thought that Vietnamese were coming to the middle of Kansas, and in fact the middle of the United States? Garden City is almost exactly in the middle of the continental U.S. And of course Mexicans and Cubans and Nicaraguans and Salvadorans were coming there as well. The immigration stream from Southeast Asia began drying up in the 1990s. We then saw an influx of Mennonites coming out of Chihuahua to work on the farms and ranches and feed yards. They didn't come to work in the packing plant. Then more recently, the latest waves have been from the Horn of Africa, Somalia primarily, but also Ethiopia, and also from Burma. The packers immediately, as soon as Trump took office, began expressing concern about where their workers were going to come from, and they have had problems really keeping workers since then, and they have turned increasingly to automation because their workforce is more precarious. The Finney County plant, the one that I began studying, it's not in Garden City, it's in Holcomb, which is a few miles west of Garden City. It employs 3,700 people, and that's for 2 shifts, and then 90% of those workers, 90% of those 3,700 people are hourly workers who are working in slaughter or processing or hides or other aspects of it. It still needs a whole lot of people, and they're still using saws and knives, and it still is very, very labor intensive.
I have a question, and I'll quote from you again. You write that the public has been far more concerned about the welfare of farmed animals than of those who turn them into the meat for our tables. You quote Upton Sinclair here as well, saying, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit in the stomach." Tell us more what your thoughts are about our...
Well, yes, Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle out of his concern for the plight of workers in the slaughterhouses in Chicago at the turn of the 20th century. What came out of the jungle was the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, because Upton Sinclair described all these very dirty, nasty conditions with rats running around the floors, and Americans were rightly concerned that they were getting all sorts of adulterants in their food, and those laws came directly out of the public outcry over the conditions in the plant. What we have seen, and not really in the late, there were then ultimately reforms in labor that came out of lots and lots of efforts by unions over the first half of the 20th century. And by the 1960s, meatpacking workers were making above the manufacturing wage. I mean, they were among the highest paid of manufacturing workers. And conditions, while they weren't great, were certainly much better than they are today. And then in the 1960s, we began to see packing houses moved out of the cities into the country to escape the unions, to be closer to their source of supply, to their animals, to cut transportation costs. And we began to see, once again, efforts to rely primarily on immigrant and refugee labor. If you look at what's happened over the last 30 years, Americans have become increasingly concerned with animal welfare, and they have pressured companies like McDonald's and other fast food restaurants to treat their animals more humanely and to also avoid things like antibiotics in the meat. And that's been the result of groups like People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, PETA, Humane Society of the United States, and other groups. I applaud that, but we haven't really seen analogous pushes to improve the plight of the workers in those plants.
You eloquently described these conditions, and you've been working at it for 30 years. And most of what you describe has been out of the view of the public. What has COVID crisis done to unveil what you've seen for 30, 40 years?
Well, I think if you recall, if you go back to March and April, when COVID became a national news story, we began to see shortages in the meat counters in certain places, and the prices of meat going up. So people were running out to get hoarding toilet paper. They were also buying lots of meat, and there were meat shortages. And so the press began talking about those meat shortages and about the fact that the reason why those shortages were occurring was that packing house workers were becoming ill, and some of them were dying. Some of the plants had to close. And so what we saw on the nightly news were sanitized clips of workers, usually on pork lines and poultry lines. So you'd see little snippets of workers disassembling hogs or chickens for maybe 30 seconds while the newscaster talked about what was happening in packing plants. And so we then began to see a great concern on the part of the general public about packing house workers. And I would argue because there wasn't enough meat in the grocery stores for people to get what they wanted. And so there was this greater attention to that. And activist groups began to seize that opportunity to talk about things like reducing line speed, that is the number of animals that are processed per hour or per minute. And so there arose a real substantial public outcry about what was happening to workers and the need to provide them with personal protection equipment, PPE, with the need to slow the lines down, with the need to do other things to protect them. And that was really a moment when the general public turned to look at meatpacking workers. Now, those stories have largely disappeared. There were lots and lots of plant closures. The number of meatpacking workers who have been infected and who have died has continued to increase dramatically. But the public concern over that, I think, has largely diminished because there's plenty of meat. So I think we've sort of gone back to where we normally are, where we're not particularly concerned about those workers. I mean, Americans in general are not all that concerned about worker welfare, and especially when you figure the workers are largely out in the rural areas. They're largely black and brown people, so most of us don't come in contact with meatpacking workers. We go to the grocery store, we buy our meat, which is already nicely packaged in cellophane, and it looks pretty, and we don't see how it got from an animal on the hoof to a pound of hamburger or a ribeye steak.
Your description of work and the organization of labor in meatpacking plants would suggest a great difficulty in trying to protect workers from the coronavirus.
In a packing plant, the profit margins are not relatively, they are thin. And so the companies make their money by cutting costs as much as possible, which means paying as little as possible for the animals and for their labor, and then getting as much product out the door as they can. And the way to maximize your productivity is by running the lines as fast as you possibly can. So for beef, they run about 350 to 425 head per hour, depending on whether it's bone in or bone out. So you have, let's just say 400 head of cattle an hour are going down the line. In order to process that many animals, you have to have lots of workers who are in many places, not everywhere, but in many places standing very close together, elbow to elbow, shoulder to shoulder, and they're doing whatever it is they're doing. In slaughter, you'll have fewer workers because you're dismembering the animal, killing the animal, skinning it, dismembering it, eviscerating it. In processing, you're cutting the carcass up into not the retail cut, but the cut right before the retail cut. In poultry, in pork, you're doing 1,000 head of hogs an hour. In poultry, you're doing 150 to 200 birds a minute. And so that requires a lot of people in order to maintain that line speed. What a lot of critics, including myself, have said, for the plants to maximize their productivity, they have to run at these fast speeds. And to do that, you have to have an adequate crew. There's a certain number of individuals on each line that are supposed to be there. If there are individuals who don't show up because they're sick or they get fired or they quit, it's called short crewing. And so that means if you're short crewed, if you're supposed to have 10 workers on a crew on a particular line and you've only got 8, the 8 workers have to do the work of 10. That means you're more likely to get injured.
It's also more likely to be exposed as well.
Yes. And so companies have pressured health officials at the local, state, and national level to keep the plants open and to declare that the plants are essential to the economy. So the workers are essential, and so they have pressured to keep them running at capacity. So what you saw at the same time that you saw workers going out sick and plants closing because of COVID outbreaks, you also saw companies asking for waivers of line speed restrictions. And so while people were getting sick and plants were closing, many of the companies were also saying, would you waive the restrictions on line speed and grant us permission to run at higher speed? And in fact, that's what the USDA did in many cases.
Here again, Kansas made the news when the Secretary of Health intervened on behalf of the industry, and certainly not in the interest of the workers. This seems a good example of where politics and economics overlap and intermingle.
And so both the Finney County beef plant, it's a Tyson plant, and the Tyson plant near my hometown in Kentucky, a chicken plant, both asked for and received waivers on line speed during that time. Not only are the packing plant houses ideal places for the spread of the infection, but of course workers don't stay in the packing houses 24 hours a day. They come and go to communities. They share rides to and from work. They're out in the community, and so it's a vector for which the spread, either you bring the COVID into the plant or you take it from the plant out into the community. And so they are especially at high risk for COVID infections.
Don, you quote at length in a forthcoming article a passage from Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. To close our interview with you, would you read this passage for us?
Okay, yeah, this is from Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, 1906. And I think it's as applicable today as it was when he wrote it. It was the same in all the packing house cities, and suddenly the newspapers and public woke up to face the gruesome spectacle of a meat famine. Immediately, of course, there was an uproar, and everyone fell to talking of the paramount rights of the public. Year after year, the people of Packingtown toiled, and the public gave never a thought to them, to their rights or their wrongs. Only now, when they were driven mad by their sufferings, did the public discover their existence. And I think that pretty much sums up what happened with the COVID back in April, when the meat supply began to diminish. We discovered the rights and the wrongs of the people that produce it. And now that we have a good supply of meat once again, we have again chosen to ignore that.
We've been visiting with Emeritus Professor Donald Stoll, University of Kansas, who has spent much of his career studying meatpacking in Kansas and around the country. And we wish to thank him for joining us today to talk about meatpacking in Kansas and COVID-19. Thanks, Don, for spending some time with us, and we'll be back in touch with you soon.
My pleasure, Jerry and Jeff. Thank you very much for having me.
You've been listening to On Caring, the Project, monthly update vodcast. Each month, we do a monthly vodcast update on the novel coronavirus. And we will continue doing so during the first couple of months of 2021. We've been visiting with Dr. Donald Stoll about the politics and economics of the COVID virus in the meatpacking industry. You will find on our website additional resources, a list of his publications relevant to the crisis of the coronavirus in the meatpacking industry. Beginning today, November 30th, 2020, On Caring, the Project will launch its first monthly podcast. You will find it on our website and also through Pinecrest